We're heading into our final week of our relationship series. It is called Likes and Loves. What our hope was to give you a toolbox, a folder, some notes. I am notorious for not filling in all of the blanks, and I know some of y'all really bothers y'all when I don't fill in a blank, but you can go online to twccalabama.com. You can click Likes and Loves. We've got last week's notes out there. All of the information you could want throughout this entire series is right there on the website. We'd love for you to go and grab if you missed a week, whatever you might have missed, but to kind of recap it, what we've said is we've used some obscure tools that in relationships are huge. There are some things that could alter your relationships. Week one, we talked about duct tape, which was communication. Communication is what holds and is kind of the core of all relationships. It's one of those things that if you it's one of those things that all of the other four things in a relationship that could go wrong, if you can communicate correctly, it will knock out 90% of the tension in relationships. Week two, we talked about caution tape, which was the boundaries that God gives us in His Scripture, in His Word. It was boundaries where this is what we said. If you look at relationships that have gone south or have been destroyed, what you'll find more often than not is we've gone outside of the boundaries that God gave us, not to be restrictive, but to keep us healthy, because we were created for relationships. We've talked about sticky notes, what it looks like in a world of sexual immorality where the world says do it one way, but God says do it another, and those labels that get put on us are those labels that we put on ourselves. And then last week we talked about tennis balls, which was simply talking about the anxiety of relationships, which comes in finances and parenting and all of that. I wanted to finish out with what I believe is the number one tool to enhance every single relationship. I believe that if we could get this topic right, it would drastically change not just our relationships, but it would drastically change our own hearts, our own perception, our own world. I got a thing I want to do this morning. So here's the deal. One, this ain't your mama's church, so I need your participation back with me, all right? A lot of pastors come up here and they got these big fancy TVs and then kind of hit the button. I got a whiteboard. I love whiteboards. I love sticky notes and I love whiteboards. So I'm going to ask a few questions this morning, and I need you to shout out answers back to me. It's okay. I promise you can talk to the pastor. We're giving you permission, and we're about to find out who all of our Pentecostal-leaning people are too, because you will be the loudest. But amen, there it is. So here's my first question. What are a few things, we'll go with about 4 or 5, what are a few things in our world that you might say you would be negative about? Like, what are some things that causes negativity in your life that are going on in the world today? What? Traffic. That was not in the first service. Awesome answer. Traffic, the bridge, politics, very negative. Crime, work. One more. News. All right, now let me ask you a question. Not necessarily you, but what are some things in our world that people get offended about? What are some things that you would say in our world can cause some great offense in our world? Church. I got real quiet with that one. It's all right. We can be honest. Ma'am? World. What else causes offense? Opinions. Unless they're mine and they're always right. Did you say the golf course? The gospel. Gotcha. I'm going to ride the golf course too, though. All right, now let me ask a final question. This doesn't have to be you, because this may get a little to the heart. But let's say it was a different person or at a different church in town. If you said there was something that somebody could do to another person that would cause bitterness or unforgiveness in their life, what would some of those things be that would cause us to stay bitter that somebody or something did? Gossip. Slander. Lies. Criticize. And I'm going to fill in the last one, and I'm going to say abuse. There we go. We're going to come back to that. Here's my question. What would our relationships look like if all of the negativity, if all of the offense, and if all of the bitterness were taken out of all the relationships? Think about that for a second. Now, I know it's hard to even imagine because just about every relationship has a twinge of something in it, right? But what would it look like if you literally had no negativity in a relationship? Crazy. What would it look like if nobody got offended? If everybody walked around and nobody got offended? Or even more, what would it look like if we had no hurt, bitterness, and unforgiveness in our relationships? I'll tell you what it would look like. It would look like the relationships that God created them to be. You see, God created us to have amazing relationships, to live life and have life in abundance, and to interact in such a way that relationships would bring such a monumental health to our lives. But yet somehow over the course of the world and over the course of our relationships, the enemy has crept in each of these, whether it be negativity, whether it be offense, whether it be bitterness, creeps into our relationships, and it doesn't just affect that relationship, but it oftentimes splashes over to all of our relationships. But see, here's the crazy thing, is when I asked that question, what would it look like and can we get there? I was talking to somebody this week, and I was telling them, kind of the direction I was going, and they were like, can you even get a relationship that has no negativity, no offense, and no hurt and bitterness? And the answer is actually yes. And it's spelled out for us in the Bible. What we've said over the course of this entire relationship series is that everything is spelled out in Scripture when it comes to relationships. God's given us the blueprint on what the absolute healthiest relationship in the world could look like, and that is free of all of this. And here's the best news about it. It's 100% up to you. You get to choose. Nobody else can make you be negative. Nobody else can make you walk around in offense. Nobody else can make you hold on to bitterness. It is 100% your choice. We're going to look at a story this morning. I know some of you are like, no, that's not my choice. You don't understand what they did. We're going to get to that. We're going to look at a story. If you got your Bibles, turn to Genesis, very first book of the Bible. If you don't do the church thing or the God thing, man, welcome. We're glad you're here. It's the first one. Open it. Flip a few pages. We're going to be there. If you don't have a Bible, we're going to throw it up on the screen, and we're going to talk about the greatest tool that God has given us, and it's an eraser. It's an eraser. It is a whiteboard eraser. This tool right here could drastically change every relationship you have. We're going to look at a guy by the name of Joseph. If you grew up in the church world, you might have heard about his amazing coat of many colors. But that's the story we're going to be at, and it's a fairly lengthy story. I'd encourage you to go read it. Well, I've kind of chopped it up this morning for time's sake. So we're going to start where Joseph, to give you a little backstory on it, Joseph had a bunch of brothers, and he had a dream from God, and that his brothers were one day, like he talked about, the wheat was bowing down to him. It was correlation of his brothers are going to bow down to him. Let me ask you a question. How many of y'all have a brother or sister? Raise your hand. What kind of reaction would you have if your brother or sister walked up and said, oh, by the way, God gave me a dream. You're going to bow down to me one day. Yeah, it wouldn't go well. I would throat punch them. But Joseph went and told his brothers about the dream. And so this is where we kind of find the story, is after he's explained to them that one day, by the way, y'all are going to bow down to me. When Joseph's brothers saw him coming, they recognized him in the distance. As he approached, they made plans to kill him. That was one heck of a dream. They're going to kill him. Here he comes the dreamer, they said. Come on, let's kill him and throw him in one of these cisterns, which was just a really big hole in the ground. So they were going to kill him, dispose of the body. And then we could tell our father a wild animal has eaten him. Then we'll see what becomes of his dreams. But when Reuben heard of their scheme, he came to Joseph's rescue. Let's not kill him, he said. Why should we shed any blood? Let's just throw him into the empty hole here in the wilderness, which I'm not really sure that's a better scenario. So rather than kill him and throw him in a hole, we're going to throw you in a hole and let you die. A slow, painful death. Then he'll die without our laying a hand on him. But Reuben was secretly planning to rescue Joseph and return him to his father. So when Joseph arrived, his brothers ripped off the beautiful robe he was wearing. They grabbed him and they threw him in the hole. They threw him in the hole. Think about that for a second. Your own flesh and blood. The people that you're probably closest to, the ones that you sit around a dinner table, the ones that you laughed with, the ones as a boy you grew up with, playing stickball in the backyard, running through the woods with. You know, you're tight. Brothers and sisters are generally really tight. The closest people to you didn't just talk trash behind your back, but then they went about and did something physical, threw you in a hole. So in the hole, instead of killing him, this group of traders came by. They actually sold Joseph into slavery. They sold him into slavery. Think about that for a second. So one day, all your hopes and dreams, all your future plans, life is good. I'm dad's favorite. I'm kind of the teacher's pet. I got this cool coat. Life is just good. The very next day, everything that you thought you knew, everything that you thought you had hoped for, is shattered. Fine one day, shattered the next. I'm going to give you 3 keys this morning to unlocking amazing relationships. The first key is this: love like you've never been hurt. Love like you've never been hurt. Here at TWCC, we believe that marriages don't have to end in dysfunction, and we believe that marriages don't have to end in destruction. We believe that parents and kids can have phenomenal relationships, and we believe that within the church world that we could cut out a lot of the junk that we've grown up with in church, that we don't have to split churches. We can all get together in unity. But here's what the problem is in most of those situations: is it is the spirit of offense. It's offense. Offense creeps in. We live in a world that is just offended. We get offended about everything. But here's the crazy thing. Again, 100% choice. You have 100% choice of whether to live offended. It's 100% your choice. I don't believe that you could truly worship Christ and be in a life of offense. I think it's really hard to come in and sing some of the songs that we're singing with our arms high and, oh, God, I love you, but deep down inside, you're offended against somebody, whether it's for a political reason, whether it's a race issue, whether it's a football issue, whether it's a work issue. We walk around in such offense that, honestly, I believe our horizontal relationships with each other directly affect our relationship with Christ. There's 2 stages of offense. The first is this: it's the feeling of offense. This is something that can happen so quick that we probably have no control over. The feeling of offense is, it's a thought, it's a flash of emotion. It's that moment when somebody says something and you kind of pause, you're like, oh, no, you didn't. You didn't just say that to me. Or somebody, you're at a ball field and they dog your kid because he made an error and you're like, oh, excuse me? Or it's one of those where your kid says something and you're like, you ain't going to talk that way to your mama. It's that really quick offense. It's when something that happens so fast, you just immediately have a relationship. But here's the problem: that feeling of offense, if you let it sit and you let it continue to work up inside your heart and inside your spirit, it will eventually consume whatever relationship that is. If it's a parent-child relationship, that little word, that phrase, that statement can actually consume you to the point where that offense can drastically alter your relationship with your parents even after they're dead. Offense can start with just a feeling, but it can turn into a destruction. In marriage, we oftentimes we transpose our emotions. We can get offended about something throughout the day, and we walk in and we take it out on the person that we love the most, and they didn't even do anything. But offense, when it gets down into your soul, can actually splatter on so many people that if we end up walking in offense, it will directly affect every single relationship that we have. The second stage of offense, though, is where it really gets dangerous, because you can feel offended. It's quick emotion, but you can move on. But the second stage is where it gets super dangerous: the choice to live or not live offended. To live or not live offended. And there is a huge difference. But Jesus talked about the world that looks like today where everybody's walking around in offense. He says it this way, Matthew 24:10. Then many will take offense, they'll betray one another, and they will hate one another. We see this in the story of Joseph. The brothers took offense and they hated their brother to the point where their actions led to a life-altering situation. I believe it's why you see so many churches on every street corner. As we've let offense creep into the church, you'll have a church on this end of the road and a church across the street from the road, and it's because somebody in this one got offended and they broke off, and I'm going to take my ball and go home. And now not only am I offended and we've kind of split a church, but what we've done is now you would say something like this: I hate that church. And see, that's crazy. Like, I could rattle off some churches right now, and some of y'all would have this feeling rise up in you, but the enemy has done a great job within the church of using offense to break apart what Jesus left as the cornerstone and the hope of the world. I believe it's why in marriages we see the divorce rate. It's flipped 51% to where more people are divorced than stay married, and it's because we get an offense. We get an offense that we can't get past, and next thing you know, that offense that we're living in offense, it turns into something that continues into the marriage to eventually it destroys it. You see it all throughout parent-child relationships. In the prison system, there's some crazy statistics out there, and they're consistent across the board, that when they talk to inmates, what they find is there is massive offense against a father. Almost 7 out of 10 of them will say that they are offended, whether the father walked out of the home, whether the father abused them, and that offense turns into anger. And that anger turns into action, and that action results in the crime and the assaults and the murder, all of that crazy stuff. And if you trace it all back, you could trace it back to offense. I was offended. I lived with offense. That thought became a word. That word became an action. That action radically changed lives. It's why every American in some capacity lives with anxiety or anger or depression, and it's because we live a life offended. But here's the crazy part of it is we actively invite offense into our homes. We actively invite offense into our thoughts and into our soul. And oftentimes we've become addicted to it. It's crazy, right? Here's what that looks like. I watch the news, I get offended about what somebody says on the news, and then that ruins my whole day. I invited it. I turned the power on. I flipped it to that channel, whatever channel you watch. I invited it. Now I'm offended, and I'm walking around all day living in offense, and instead of being a light, I'm actually splattering some really unhealthy emotions. It's living in offense. We invite it. Social media, start scrolling. You start scrolling, and you see something that's said, and you're like, oh my gosh, now I'm offended, and you fire off or you fire back, and you walk around, you're just angry. We're just angry, but here's the crazy thing. We invite it. We invite it into our home. Instead of listening to something that you know somebody's going to say something that offends you, listen to something that only brings positive into the world. And Joseph, of all people, had every right to be offended by our metric. I would be offended if y'all drugged me, threw me into a hole, sold me into slavery, and talked about killing me. I would be offended. You would be offended. By all metrics, he had the right to be offended. He had the right to live offended. The rest of his life, he could have walked around and said, you know what? I'm angry. I am offended. His brothers laughed at him. They mocked him. They talked trash about him. They drastically altered his life. They crushed his hopes and dreams. Every reason that we can check the box and say, I'm allowed to live offended, Joseph had that. But he turned this horrible situation into the best situation that it could be, because then Joseph, he gets sold, goes to Egypt, he gets in this home with a guy named Potiphar, and rather than letting his offense take over and be a negative, he actually rose in the ranks to be the most trusted guy in Potiphar's house. He was kind of the top of the chain in that world that he lived in, and he had everything going on in the situation possible. But then the story picks up. So he's been sold. He goes through all of that. He raises back up. He has a good life again. And then Potiphar's wife comes in and tries to talk Joseph into having an affair. Well, Joseph says no. He did exactly what he was supposed to. And then he did what the Bible says. It says flee from sexual immorality. Joseph said no. He fled. He ran. He did everything God instructs us to do. But then the wife of Potiphar goes in and tells her husband that he actually came on to her and he assaulted her. And the story picks up right here where it says, then Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about Joseph and how he had treated her. So he took Joseph and he threw him into prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. I finally got everything back to where it's livable. And now I find myself in a prison. And it's not 3 hots and a cot like today. You're in the king's prison. It's a dungeon. You're chained to a wall. And then he's got a guy in prison that gets out and he's like, hey, remember me when you talk to the king? Like, go tell him about it. The guy forgot him. Like, everything imaginable that could have gone wrong for Joseph has gone wrong in his life. I would be offended and I would be negative. And I'll tell you, the one person I would probably be the most offended and negative towards is God. Sitting in a dark hole by myself would have been the easiest place at the lowest point of my life to be like, hello, where are you at? You gave me the dream. It was your dream, not my dream. You gave me the dream. I expressed your dream, and look where it landed me. Hey, I did the right thing, God. You told me don't do this, and I didn't do it, and I even did what you said, and I did all of the right things, and yet I'm here. I'm in a prison. I am offended, and I am negative. I can tell you this. How many of us would be in a dark prison and be positive? How many of us would be sitting in jail for doing the right thing, falsely accused, and be positive? Not many of us. I look at myself in this situation, and I think that my negativity would have consumed me. What starts in the heart turns into actions. When negativity starts in the heart, it starts to seep into every action, into every relationship, along with every person that we encounter. And we live in a world that's constantly negative. We live in a world where it's almost popular to be negative about the situation. You see, here's the deal with negativity. Negativity is a heart problem. Negativity isn't a situation problem. Negativity is a heart problem, and it's your heart. Therefore, your problem. My negativity is my heart and my problem. Nobody can make you be negative. When you really look at negativity, it's a heart issue. And oftentimes we'll justify it as like, well, you know, you got that person that walks in, they always got a negative comment, and they'll justify it by like, well, you just want me to be honest, don't you? Well, here's my question. Are you ever honest about positive things? No, we hide behind that justification. Throw you in a hole, sell you into slavery. I got the right to be negative, right? Wrong. It was a choice. Joseph said, you know what? I am going to take my situation and I'm going to bring light into a very dark world. You know what? My brothers tried to kill me. I did the right thing. I got falsely accused. Not only am I going to turn it into the best situation, but everywhere he goes, it says at the end, Joseph was a favorite of the prison's warden. I would not be his favorite guy. I'd be mad. I would be angry. I would be negative. I would be offended. But Joseph said, you know what? I'm going to choose to be positive. I'm going to choose to be a light. Here's how you do that. You delete the negative and embrace the positive. You delete it. Instead of saying something negative, stop, pause, and say something positive. Well, there's nothing positive about them. Sure there is. They're created in the image of God the same as you are. If you can't find anything positive about them, that's a you problem, not a them problem. That's a toe stomper to me. Because I can be really negative really fast, but it's a me problem. So here's how you do it. You delete the negative. You embrace the positive. Last week in parenting, we talked about children in a home get 10 negative statements to 1 positive. What does that look like if you reverse it? 10 positive to one negative. Before you say something negative to somebody, start with a positive. You know what that does? It's going to be really hard to stay negative when you go positive. For those of us hiding behind justification or perceived honesty, start being just as honest. Start looking for stuff about somebody positive. Start looking for things that would brighten their day. And here's why. Because a negative mind will never give you a positive life. A negative mind will never give you a positive life. You can't walk around and have a positive life if you're always negative. It cannot live together. Your positivity will brighten a room. Your negativity will darken it. Before you say something negative, when everybody's hounding on your boss, when everybody's talking about how bad your workplace is, when everybody's talking about, oh, it's just awful, it's just awful, it's awful, instead of feeding into the negative, say something positive. It's kind of fun sometimes. If somebody walks up and says something negative about somebody, say something positive about that same person. Watch the reaction. It's kind of amusing. Here's my question. What makes us a magnet for negative people? If you're a magnet for negative people, that's a problem. Be positive. Be a light. You want to change the dynamics of a parent-child relationship? Speak life and speak positive into them. You want to change the dynamics at work? Instead of finding everything wrong with work, walk in and find everything right. It will change your day. Walk in and start finding everything that is good with the world. Is it wrong, or is it just not the way you would do it? Instead of being negative, go, meh, it's not my deal. It's not my deal. If you're not helping improve the situation, if you're not helping making it right, don't be part of the complaining. Complaining just to complain will drag you down. It will drag every relationship you're a part of down. If you're not part of the solution, stop griping about the problem. Be the change, be the positive, be the light in a dark room. Instead of darkening the room, what you ought to look like is when you come, people ought to go, oh no, here they come. Why are they always just so happy? Here comes Mr. Happy. He's always just so positive. We never hear that. What you hear a lot of times, though, is, oh no, here they come. What are they going to complain about now? What are they going to gripe about now? What are they going to? You ought to be the one that when you walk in the room, they go, oh no. That guy gets on my nerves because he's always so happy. They just get on my nerves. And here's what you're going to find. If you're that person, somebody's going to ask you this question. Why are you so happy? And they're going to do it in a weird, sarcastic tone. But you know what that does? It gives you an opportunity to share Christ. And here's the crazy thing. If you're that happy person, you will stand out. You'll stand out like a light bulb in a dark room, because we live in such a dark world where it's so in vogue to be negative. When a positive person walks in, people notice. People notice. As Christ followers, as a church, we ought to be the biggest light in the city. As a Christ follower, you ought to be the biggest light at the ball field. You ought to be the biggest light at your workplace. You ought to be the biggest light on campus. You ought to be the biggest light at Kentuck or driving across the bridge. Be the light. Positive will consume negative. Positive thoughts will consume negative. But you've got to train your mind. Your negativity is a heart issue. And it's yours to cure. It's yours to fix. And it's the absolute, total opposite of what Christ calls us to be. He calls us to be a light. Be known for what you love, not what you hate. Be known for what you love. Oh, no, they're going to come in and talk about, oh, Mr. Happy's going to come in. Be all positive about. Be known for what you love. I think the church oftentimes is so known for what they hate that we've forgotten to add the love in. People know because I'm always screaming at the darkness. I'm always negative. I'm always walking around offended because somebody said something. What if the church was known as being the light? What if church was known as a place that people could come in with whatever problem they had? They could come in from a really big storm, and that people wouldn't be negative and they wouldn't be offended with how they dressed or what they said or how they talked or where they had a ball. What would church look like if you could walk in at the darkest point of your life and somebody walked up and said, wow, glad you're here. We love you. Crazy story. I've got a youth pastor buddy who's now a pastor, and he's told this story a bunch. Is that he was doing a big youth deal. And Everybody was in. Everybody was sat. They just got done with worship, and through the doors in walked this teenager. And he sat down on the back row, and this was the guy that everybody knew in town. This was the guy who was always in trouble. He was the guy you didn't want your daughter to date. You didn't want your kids to hang out with. You didn't want them to be friends with. And he said he saw him walk in the back door. And when he saw him, he thought, even as he's talking, he thought, oh, man, he's here. He was really excited that he was here, and he wanted to go back there, and he's like, I'm going to make a mental note. I'm going to go talk to him at the end of the service. And he said, actually, he watched two teenagers get up and move away from the kid when he sat down. And he said the service went on, and then at the end, he started to make a beeline for the back, and he got hung up in a conversation. He got hung up in another conversation, and he missed him, and he actually just kind of forgot about it until the next morning. And the next morning, through the news, it came out that a young man had taken his own life. And within his goodbye letter, he actually said this: I told God, if you wanted me to live, to speak to me. And I walked into his house, and nobody spoke to me. And that sounds like a really drastic story. And when this guy tells it every time, I've heard him tell it 3 or 4 times, it just brings tears to his eyes. And that breaks my heart. That all it would take is a word. All it would take is a thought that turns into a word, that turns into an action. Not just to change somebody's life, but to change their eternity. Situations don't determine negativity. Your heart determines negativity. The third key, and we're going to kind of close up with this. The third key is this: forgive the way you've been forgiven. Fast forward, Joseph gets out of prison because he can interpret a dream, and the Pharaoh had a dream, and nobody could answer it. And the guy who was supposed to remind him actually remembered, he's like, there's a guy in prison that does this dream thing, and he said, go get him. And they got him, and he interpreted the dream, and it was correct. And next thing you know, Joseph, the guy who had all the reasons in the world to be offended, the guy who had all the reasons in the world to be negative, the guy who brought light into every dark situation, now finds himself as the number 2 guy in Egypt, right under Pharaoh. He's the second most powerful man in the world of that time. And his brothers, they're in this huge famine, and so they're making their way. They're about to starve to death, and they make their way to Egypt. And lo and behold, the young brother that they thought was dead, or that they thought they'd for sure never have to see again, when they go in to ask for food, who do they have to ask? Well, you want to talk about a humbling situation. Years and years later, the brothers had to stand before the one that they turned their back on. And Joseph says to them, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? All week long, that statement right there, that question has stuck with me. Am I in the place of God? Because when we live offended, when we live in negativity, when we live in unforgiveness, we're taking the place of God. It's not our offense to hold. It's not our negativity to grasp onto. It's God's. He has big shoulder. It's God's job to handle our situations. It's God's job. Like, revenge is mine, saith the Lord, kind of thing. But so often we'll take that on ourselves. And Joseph says, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? Am I the one that's going to rain judgment down on you? Judging others is not our job. If you stop judging others, you take away all offense. If you stop judging situations and others, you take away the negativity. When you take yourself and you put yourself where we're supposed to be and where God's supposed to be, it changes the dynamic. You see, we view forgiveness through our lens. Well, you don't understand, Pastor. They hurt me. You don't understand how offended I am. You don't understand what these people believe. But see, here's the crazy thing. Through our lens, this is all okay. I have a right to be offended at what they said, right? We even wrap it in Christian justification. Well, I have the right to be offended. I have the right to be negative. You don't understand my situation. I lost somebody. See, I would be massively offended at God in Joseph's situation. We have this right through our lens. But when you look at it through the tool of God, what you find is that God uses an eraser. Because when you start taking away all the things that we're offended about, when you start to take away all of the things that we're negative about, we're negative about opinions, take that out. It's not your deal. When you start taking away all the things that have hurt you, when you start taking away all of the bitterness that you have. You see, Joseph had every right to be angry with his brothers. He had every right to be bitter. They abused him. They talked trash. They turned their back. You see, for us, forgiveness often looks like a chalkboard. See, chalkboard, when you write on it, or chalk walls, I hate chalk walls because they always look really pretty the first thing you write on it. But if you ever change it, it's just a smudge. You see, we often forgive that way. It's like, well, I'll kind of forgive you, but there's still this residue that when something bumps into that, you instantly go negative. When something bumps into that, you instantly get offended. It splatters over everything because we've only partially forgiven. But God says, use an eraser. He says, it's not your negativity. It's not your deal. Let me handle it. It's not your offense. It's not your hurt. I will handle it. And oftentimes we live under such a state of condemnation within our own world, because here's the crazy thing. It's hard to forgive others when you don't believe you're totally forgiven. Could God really forgive that? Could God really forgive that abortion? You see, I don't know. Maybe. But God says, I forgive. Wholly. I forgive unconditionally. I wipe it as far as the east is from the west. That affair, you know, God forgives a lot, but man, I really messed that up. So we hang on to these things. Abortions, affairs, one of the big 10 sins. We hang on to that. And then it resonates because we have a hard time forgiving others because we have a hard time believing that God can forgive us. If you don't feel forgiven, you'll have a hard time forgiving others. You see, you could look at this story and say, well, that's cute, Pastor. It's a story in Genesis that happened over like however many thousands of years ago. Well, let's look at another story in the Bible. Because Joseph's just a guy, right? It's one in a million. He was just different. But you don't understand what I went through. Well, let's look at a different guy. About 2,000 years ago. It was a guy that said, you know what? All of my closest friends abandoned me. As a matter of fact, my best friend in the whole world turned his back on me and ran. The people that used to love me, the people that I've spent time with, that I've invested in, that I've loved beyond measure, unconditionally, that I've comforted, that I've done everything right, they didn't just turn their back on me, but they spit in my face. And they mocked me. And they said things that just tore me down. And physically, you want to talk about abuse? The same people that I came to love, that I came to give hope, they beat me. And then they mocked me and they dragged me up a hill. And they hung me between two guys who were the lowest of the low. Like, I came to help you. And see, if I had been on the cross, I'd have been like, send the angels now, zap them all. End of story. But in the darkest moment, after he had been beaten, after he had been abused, after he had been trashed, what did Jesus say? Hanging on that cross. He said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they did. What if our relationship looked like that? Where if we said, you know what? God, forgive them. They don't know what they did. I'm not going to be offended. I'm not going to be negative. I'm going to love like I've never been hurt. I'm going to be positive, even in the darkest moment. Even if I'm in a prison of offense and the world is just crashing down, I'm going to find the positive because I know that God created me with a plan and a purpose and to have life and to have it abundantly. And while I may not understand, I don't know why you took them. I don't know why this happened. I don't know why this situation is going on, but I'm going to trust without borders. And then I'm going to forgive like you forgave me. I'm going to wipe it clean. No residue. No lingering. Love like you've never been hurt. Forgive like you've been forgiven. On the back of your guide, I want you to take it home this week. It's not for this morning. I want you to take it home because I want you to answer some questions that you're really going to have to dig in. Who's offended you? Who do you need to forgive unconditionally? Who do you need to wipe clean the slate with? There's some questions. I want you to go into this week and answer those questions and begin the journey of amazing relationships the way God created them to be. And remember this, when it comes to forgiveness, no matter what anybody has done to you, you'll never have to forgive more than God's forgiven you. We have the example right here, from front to back, the key to every relationship: love and forgiveness. Bow your head with me. God, this morning, there's a lot of, well, you don't know what they did, or you don't know what I've done. And God, this morning I pray as we go out into the week, Father, I pray as we go out into the world, we go out into a negative, dark world, that we could be the light, that we can represent you, that we can shine like you shine, that no matter what comes against us, we can know that you have our back, that you are our strength in every situation, in every storm of life, and that it's not our offense to hold. When I look at what you did, you sent your Son, and I look at what we did to him, breaks my heart. So God, I pray this week as we go forward that we can learn to wipe the slate clean and have relationships like you created them and you gave us the example to live them out. And we thank you in advance. In Jesus' name.